this is a pretty cool adventure to go on, and it definitely inspired me to think about this sort of concept of finding your way, because it's the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, but I think it's oftentimes people are just trying to find their way in a personal, emotional level as well. Welcome to the second Snapshots of Spain book chat. Today we're going to be discussing Versions, which, you guessed it, is the second novella in the Snapshots of Spain collection. This one just re-released as an individual story on Wednesday, so you can now find it. There's a link in my bio and my stories, so definitely go and check that out if you haven't got your hands on a copy yet. But I'm super excited for you to join me here today to learn a bit more about this story, and specifically about the Camino de Santiago, because this is a really special setting, in a sense, that is a huge part of this story. And I think it's really famous here in Spain, but it's perhaps not something that everybody is familiar with. So I am excited to see you all and to share a bit more about this with you. So thank you to those of you popping in. I really appreciate the support. And I did want to mention that today's book chat is going to be a solo endeavor. So I do have a few questions and answers already prepared, but by any means, as I'm reading through the story or as I'm talking about these things, if you have any further questions you would like to ask, just go ahead and drop those in the comments. That way we'll have plenty to talk about. So before I jump straight into reading you an excerpt from the story, which is the way I like to start these book chats, I wanted to share a little bit about the character dynamics in this story, because it's somewhat unique in the sense that I would say this story has two main characters, but really there's one who we're following about 80% of the time, and that is Steve. Steve starts out as a study abroad student in Santiago de Compostela, which is in northern Spain in the Galicia region. And then we have a time jump where it's 6 years later and we see him returning to Spain, and that's where most of the story takes place. However, this secondary main character is named Sem, and he's the person that I'm going to read to you about in the excerpt. He is a pilgrim who walks the Camino de Santiago, and he happens to meet Steve and Steve's friends in Santiago while they're studying, and they have just one brief conversation about this topic, this idea of different versions inside of us. And it's just one of those pivotal moments for Steve and his friends. It kind of changes the way that he views everything in life. So although the character Sem, that I'm going to read you this section about, is not as much of a main character throughout the whole story, you do learn so much from him, and it's really what he shares with these friends that moves along the whole story, and you do see a little bit more from him as well throughout the story, but I don't want to spoil too much. But basically, just to let you know that if you've seen the blurb about this story already and you know it's more about Steve, you might be wondering what is going on in this section. But I wanted to share this excerpt with you because I think it does a really beautiful job of setting this story along the Camino de Santiago, and then I think that'll lead into some great conversation for us here today. So let me pull it up on my tablet here and read to you the beginning of Versions. Okay, here we go. Some of the pilgrims walked for religious reasons. Others preferred to describe themselves as spiritual. Others still did it as an athletic feat. Many of them did it in order to find deeper connection to God, to nature, to themselves. Regardless, each one seemed to find something different but needed along the famous Camino de Santiago, also known simply as the Way. Sem was what some would call a seasoned pilgrim on this trek across northern Spain. He had already completed the Camino Francés, or the French way, 3 times in the last 7 years. He imagined he'd walked that path dozens of times before he met his maker, and that thought greatly comforted him. Although there are quite a few different ways, starting in different regions of Spain, France, and Portugal, Sem wasn't concerned with trying out new paths. His journey was to walk the same trails, each time conjuring up something, or as he preferred to think of it, someone different from deep inside of him. Many of the other pilgrims who Sem met would ask him why he wanted to complete the Camino so many times, and his answers varied depending on the day and the person. For the occasional fellow pilgrim who would overhear him telling a different story to someone else, this came across as dishonest, but Sem didn't see it that way. In his relatively short life in Holland, Sem felt he had already lived multiple lives. He'd been the promising young athlete, the son of an absent father, the caregiver of a terminally ill mother, the law student, the sales attendant, the powerhouse lawyer, the recovering alcoholic, the hippie. Above all, he now considered himself a walker. And so, if he could be all of those people, how could he not have all of the reasons? On his 143rd day on the way, Sem arrived on foot in Santiago de Compostela for the 4th time in his 32 years. Not that he had walked 143 days straight. Sem knew the exact number of days he had spent on the Camino de Santiago in total because he had kept a journal that spanned all 4 of his journeys. Instead of starting over with the number 1 on the first day of each pilgrimage, he just picked up where he last left off. Sem approached the Catedral de Santiago on shaking knees, engulfed by euphoria and accomplishment, just as he had the previous three times. The imposing Gothic cathedral towered over him, and he kneeled down to kiss the ground beneath it. That building. It was an important landmark of the city in and of itself. However, as the endpoint of one of the world's longest pilgrimage routes, it meant so much more to Sem and his fellow walkers. All of the town's winding roads somehow seemed to lead to that one sacred spot, ensuring weary pilgrims would not be led astray in their final moments on the Camino. Sem said a silent prayer of thanks, to God, the universe, or to himself, he did not know, then entered the building to behold the relics of the Apostle St. James. Known as Santiago in Spanish, St. James was the namesake of the Way, and visiting his final resting place within the church was the final station of the pilgrimage. So that is how this novella Versions begins. And like I said, I think it's a really cool snippet to just throw you straight into the Camino de Santiago and what this experience can be like. As I said in the beginning there, it is very different depending on the different people. It can be a religious experience. It can be more of a personal journey within. It can be just, an athletic feat, because this is like 3 or 4 weeks you would be walking day and night for a long, long time. So it's quite the experience, but I hope that kind of gives you an idea of what it is like. And yeah, so I'm going to just jump into questions. Excuse me, there are a couple that I got in advance and a couple that I get all the time. So I'm going to go straight into those. But if those of you who are here have anything else you would like to ask about this story, about the Camino, about writing or reading, whatever, just drop those in the comments and I will get to them as I can. But basically, yeah, the Camino de Santiago is a real thing. That's always the first question for people who aren't familiar with it. And it is absolutely a real pilgrimage that has been in place. It's here, like I said, there's that main route. I would say that the Camino Francés is the one that goes across northern Spain, and it's called the French way because it starts so far east that you are actually in France when you begin it, and then you walk across the entirety of Spain to the other end where you reach Santiago de Compostela, which is where this beautiful cathedral is. And that cathedral is said to have the remains of St. James. And so that's why this is the way of St. James, the pilgrimage to reach his relics. And it has had different meaning over the years. It's started as early back as, I want to say, the 12th century. So this is a really, really traditional thing that people do. But like I said, that route is the most common, the most famous. However, there are different routes, like I said, some that start in Portugal and other places in Spain as well. So that is the basics of the Camino. I'm not an expert on it, but if you have any other questions, I can try to answer them. And the second question I get all the time is, have you done the Camino de Santiago? And I have to be honest with you, I have not. This is something that's been on my mind for a long time. I studied in Spain back in 2011, and my program was in Alicante, so nowhere near to Santiago. However, there was an entire class on the Camino de Santiago, and they did a short trip. There's like a shortened version of the Camino that you can do in 5 or 6 days. And there were a number of people in my course who did that. I did not end up doing it. It's something that I'll keep in mind for the future, but it is a very big deal. I think it's something that you would want to prepare for physically, definitely, but also emotionally and mentally. So it's not something that I've done yet. However, I have been to Santiago de Compostela, and that is a really incredible city. And I think being there, and I've visited some other cities in the north, like Oviedo and Burgos, that are along the Camino de Santiago, and there is this really special vibe that you get being along the pilgrimage, coming into contact with these different walkers. They are just really interesting people who are on an interesting journey. And so I think being there and experiencing it, and I've been inside of the cathedral, and I've seen the resting place of St. James. There's also a statue inside that a lot of the walkers will embrace when they finally reach the church. Like, it was really cool to experience, even though I have not done the walk itself. Just to be in the presence of people who are doing something like that it's really incredible. And so I always recommend it to people, even if you don't necessarily have time to do the full pilgrimage. If you could do a shortened version, or at least just visit this city and this cathedral, it is really incredible. It's kind of difficult to get to. I live in southern Spain, so there are like no direct flights, no direct trains. It's definitely a more difficult place to get to than the typical cities people tend to visit in Spain, but I highly recommend it. I think it's very much worth it. And I see I've got a question coming in. How long is the full walk? Great question. I do not have the numbers right in front of me, but I want to say it's about 500 kilometers, a little bit more. So I'm really bad at the conversions, but maybe about 300 miles. It's a lot. It's a lot of walking. Like I said, it depends on how experienced you are. It depends on your age and your physical level, like all of those things. But I think most people tend to complete it in about a month, more or less. If you read versions, you'll see that Steve takes his time with it. He really spends a lot of time on the Camino. He doesn't walk as much each day as the average walker does, but you can, do it in very different ways, whereas Sem is the opposite. Sem was definitely trying to get like his best time each time he goes, and I think I was going to have him doing a best time at like 25 days. So don't quote me on these numbers. I might be a little bit off, but more or less that is about what you're looking at. And so I just think, let me see, is the trail marked so you know you're going in the correct way? Yeah, so it is, but I think that it can be easy to get turned around as well. So another thing that I did do, basically out of pure interest, but then it turned into great research for this story, is that a family that I follow on YouTube actually did this Camino together. So the parents and the 2 kids video vlogged their entire experience doing the Camino de Santiago. And so I feel like I got a really immersive look at what this was like, the vibe was on the trails. And this question does come up. The trail is marked in as far as trails tend to be marked. There's a symbol that is really famous for the Camino de Santiago, and that is a seashell. So many of the pilgrims will actually pick up a seashell at some point. It's like I can't remember the exact term. There's a specific term for the type of shell, but it's a very traditional white shell usually that people will buy and they'll put on their backpack, just kind of to be a part of the pilgrimage. It's something that's very common, and then of course it's like a souvenir from your experience as well. So on the trails, oftentimes you would see just a seashell, like I think often a yellow seashell, to let people know which way they're supposed to be going. But I do think it's easy to get turned around. The good thing is there are often multiple ways that you can go, and you'll still be on the right path to make it to the next stopping point. So, like I said, when I was watching this family do their Camino de Santiago journey, they would have like an app and they would be looking it up in advance, choosing which route they wanted, talking to the other pilgrims as well, discussing, this route has amazing views, but it's going to take you 2 hours longer than the other route. Or this route is really difficult, not very well marked, but it's much shorter. And so I think you're constantly making choices in terms of that, deciding what way you want to take. Even though it is one main path, I think there are often smaller routes within there that you can take. Because also something that you do definitely get a feel for in this story is that there are these albergues, basically hostels, but they're often even more primitive. They're just like really cheap lodging. Sometimes they even come with food. It really depends on the place. If it's a really popular place for pilgrims to stop, then it's probably going to be a little bit more expensive and a little bit more commercialized. So there's also a lot of planning that goes into it when people are on the way deciding, do I want to stop in the most popular places and essentially do the route in the way most people do it? Because you can find so much information online about like what the average miles or kilometers walked per day is, and then that'll show you the typical places you might want to stop. But of course, you can plan it however you want. You can stop in different places, and so there's a lot of choice to it. I think people really can make it their own, and I think that's what makes the Camino such an interesting experience. So thank you for these questions. The one other comment I got prior to this conversation was not necessarily a question, but somebody I spoke to had recently met somebody who had done the Camino, and they were saying like, I was just incredibly impressed. This was a woman in her 60s, and she said she just went over to Spain and did this by herself. And that can sound really scary, and that can sound almost crazy to a lot of us. But I would say, again, that is what is so cool about the Camino de Santiago. I think it attracts people who are open to that and people who are happy to do a solo journey. And yet, these people are also going to be meeting so many people along the way. As you're walking, you start meeting up with different people, chatting about their life stories, and I just think it's so cool. You can tell I'm very passionate about it. I think I need to do it at some point. But yes, I do just think this is a pretty cool adventure to go on, and it definitely inspired me to think about this sort of concept of finding your way, because it's the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, but I think it's oftentimes people are just trying to find their way in a personal, emotional level as well. And I got another question. Would you think most people do the walk with friends or mostly as solo adventures? And like I said, I haven't done it myself, so it is hard to say. I think there's a pretty even mix. My understanding from the research that I've done and the people I've talked to is that it's totally just as normal to be there by yourself as to be there with your partner, with your friends, or families as well. I think that's what for me was perhaps the most exciting or jarring or unusual, that it is something that a lot of people will do with their families. And so there is a tiny bit of that included in this story as well. I won't spoil anything, but I do think it's something that when the way, the Camino, has been a part of your journey, it is often common to want to take your loved ones back and to do it with them and to have them have their own experience on the Camino as well. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a split situation, but I do think that's what's really cool about it, is that it can be whatever you want it to be for you. And I certainly tried to explore that in this story of versions. So I know I've talked so much about the Camino. I will share just briefly about the story a little bit more, unless you guys have more questions. Like I said, just drop those in the comments as they come up for you. But yeah, I think, like I said, the experience that I had in Santiago de Compostela, the atmosphere there, it was just something I wanted to bring to a story. It did feel magical to me. And so you will see parts of my experience in Santiago actually show up on the page. So when you have Steve and his cinco amigos, those are his friend group, they meet up in a park. It's like their main place to hang out. Like, that is a real park that is there in Santiago. And actually the scene where this pivotal conversation happens between Sem and the cinco amigos, that is in a bar that I've actually been to in Santiago. Agramola really does exist, and I just was uncertain. I never know if I want to use the real names of places or not. So throughout Snapshots of Spain, you mostly have places that have been, fictionalized, and they are just the creation of my imagination. But in this particular story, I did have a very specific bar in mind. It's someplace that I've been. I've sat there and had the Estrella Galicia, which is the typical beer in that region, and listened to a Celtic band play. And it was just a special moment. And so when I started to write this story, I pictured it all happening there. And I think that was a cool thing for me to implement into the story, and to kind of have that realism to it as well. Of course, I'm always trying to make these stories as authentic as possible. Although, like I said, I live in southern Spain, so my experience of Spain is very different to the experiences that I'm sometimes describing for these different characters. But I was sure to set all of the stories in cities that I've been to, places that I could give some authenticity to, because I think that really helps them come alive and them feel real. So yeah, that is the story of versions. As I shared in my stories today, the comment from my friend G, a reader of this story, she said that this one is the story in this collection that resonated the most with her, and that the message is just so important. And I absolutely agree. I think, we're all trying to find our way in some form or another in this life, no matter what stage we're at. And I tried to show that with these characters being at different points in their lives and still having this question of, like, who am I? And I think that that's a beautiful thing to remember, that it's normal to not know. And also, as Sem feels, and you get a lot more of this in the conversation that happens with them later in the story, but there is this idea that we could have different versions of ourselves inside of us, and different experiences, different people, it all brings out a different version of us, and how you choose to interact with that, to accept it, to nurture it or not, is going to determine your experience. So I hope that this conversation has got you a bit more interested in versions. If you haven't read it already, I highly encourage you to check it out. And yeah, if there are no more questions, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to talk too much about it because I really think you should read it. I think that you will enjoy it. And I think that's about it. So thank you so much for joining me today. As I said, I will share the link, the direct link to purchase this story in my Instagram stories, but you can also find all of this information on my website, dannyjnorwell.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again next week when we'll be talking about Maria. But until then, have a great rest of your weekend, and happy reading, my friends.